December 12, 1939. Seaford, Delaware. A six-story building stood against the winter sky, its windows already bright with round-clock operations. Inside, 850 workers moved between machines that hummed with a sound the world had never heard before. The first fibers of nylon synthesized from coal, air, and water began their journey through metal dyes, emerging as threads stronger than silk, more durable than anything nature had ever produced. The town of Seaford, population barely 2,000, had become the birthplace of a revolution. They called it the nylon capital of the world. No one knew that within 7 years this same material would trigger riots in American streets. If you're interested in stories about the hidden factories that changed history, consider subscribing. These are the narratives that textbooks forget. The story begins not with war, but with a man who would never see his creation change the world. Wallace Hume Carothers stood in a laboratory at the DuPont experimental station in Wilmington, Delaware on February 28, 1935. A Harvard-trained chemist, he had been hired to explore the fundamental science of polymers, long-chain molecules that could be synthesized in a laboratory rather than harvested from nature. His hands, steady despite the depression that haunted him, manipulated flasks containing adipic acid and hexamethylene diamine. Each compound contained 6 carbon atoms. When heated under pressure, they bonded into something unprecedented. Nylon 66, the first truly synthetic fiber. Carothers pulled the polymer from the beaker. It stretched without breaking. It resisted water. It held its shape under stress. In that moment, he had created what DuPont would market it as strong as steel, fine as a spider's web. But Carothers, brilliant and fragile, struggled with demons that scientific triumph could not quiet. In early 1937, his sister died unexpectedly. The loss shattered what remained of his stability. On April 29, 1937, 16 months before his nylon patent was issued, Wallace Carothers took his own life. He never saw a single nylon stocking. He never knew that his polymer would save thousands of lives in combat. He never witnessed the chaos his invention would unleash. DuPont recognized what they had. This wasn't just another industrial chemical. This was a consumer revolution waiting to happen. By late 1938, with the patent secured, the company began planning the world's first dedicated nylon production facility. They evaluated 14 potential sites. The requirements were specific. Abundant water supply, proximity to raw materials and markets, reliable transportation infrastructure, and a workforce willing to work around the clock. Seaford, Delaware, located near the Nanticoke River in Sussex County, met every criterion. The tax rates were low. The land was available. Wilmington headquarters was close enough for oversight. Construction began in March 1939. The engineers had 14 months to build something that had never existed. A 6-story MON building took shape on 609 acres of Delaware farmland. Its architecture as revolutionary as the chemistry it would house. Horizontal and vertical lines intersected in patterns that suggested speed and precision. By December 12, 1939, just 9 months after groundbreaking, the plant went operational. It was the fastest industrial construction project DuPont had ever completed. The first shift began at midnight. Molten polymer synthesized from nylon salt shipped from DuPont's Bell Works in West Virginia was forced through spinets, metal plates pierced with holes finer than human hair. The fibers emerged, cooled, and were wound onto spools. 4 million pounds of nylon in the first year, enough for 64 million pairs of stockings. The product debuted to the public at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. A model named Miss Chemistry wore the first commercial nylon stockings on stage. The crowd watched as she moved. The fabric didn't sag, didn't wrinkle, didn't run at the first snag like silk always did. DuPont had deliberately chosen not to trademark the word nylon. They wanted it to become synonymous with stockings themselves, the way zipper had replaced slide fastener in the American vocabulary. The strategy worked. On October 24, 1939, DuPont held a test sale in Wilmington for employees' families. 4,000 pairs, 3 hours sold out. On May 15, 1940, nylon stockings went on sale nationally at Gimbel's department store in New York and other major retailers across the country. Women lined up before dawn. By day end, DuPont had sold 5 million pairs. The stockings cost more than silk, $1.15 compared to $79. But women didn't care. These stockings lasted. They washed easily. They dried overnight. They didn't run at the first contact with a chair leg or a fingernail. For the first time in history, a luxury item had become accessible to working-class women. Secretaries wore the same stockings as society wives. Factory workers could afford what had once been reserved for the wealthy. Nylon democratized femininity in a way that no previous invention had managed. In 1940 alone, DuPont sold 64 million pairs. By early 1941, American women were purchasing 8 pairs per year on average. The Seaford plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers rotated through 3 shifts. The machines never stopped. And then on December 7, 1941, everything changed. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor ended nylon civilian life before it had barely begun. Japan had been America's primary source of silk, providing the material for parachutes that saved pilots' lives when their aircraft went down. With Japan now an enemy, that supply vanished overnight. The U.S. military needed an alternative and they needed it immediately. DuPont had already proven that nylon could replace silk. The polymer was stronger, more elastic, and completely immune to mold and moss, critical advantages in the humid climates of the Pacific Theater. On February 11, 1942, the War Production Board issued the order. All nylon production was to be redirected to military use. Stockings disappeared from store shelves within days. The last pairs sold on the black market for $20 each, equivalent to half a week's wages for many women. At Seaford, the transition happened in a single shift change. The same machines that had produced hosiery fiber now produced parachute material. But there was a problem. The male workforce was vanishing. Young men who had operated the polymer kettles, monitored the spinnerets, and maintained the equipment were enlisting or being drafted. By mid-1942, Seaford had lost most of its first male employees to the war effort. DuPont faced a choice. Shut down production or hire women to run a chemical plant that operated at dangerous temperatures and pressures. They chose women. Not because DuPont was progressive, not because they believed women were equal. They chose women because the war demanded production and women were the only available labor force. The women who walked through the gates of the Seaford plant in 1942 were daughters of farmers, wives of deployed soldiers, mothers trying to feed children on rationed food. Many had never worked outside the home. None had experience with industrial chemistry. But they learned. They learned to read pressure gauges and temperature dials. They learned to monitor the viscosity of molten polymer and adjust feed rates to maintain fiber consistency. They learned to operate machinery that could burn skin on contact or release fumes that could collapse lungs. And they learned to do it in 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week for the duration of the war. The plant didn't slow down. If anything, production accelerated. The parachutes that descended over Normandy on D-Day were made from Seaford nylon. The cords that reinforced B-29 bomber tires capable of withstanding the stress of takeoff with a 140,000-pound aircraft came from Seaford. The mosquito netting that kept troops alive in malaria zones was Seaford nylon. The ropes that secured cargo on transport ships were Seaford nylon. From 1942 to 1945, female workers at Seaford oversaw the production of material for millions of parachutes. The exact number remains classified in some military records, but estimates suggest that Seaford nylon went into more than half of all American parachutes deployed during the war. Every airman who bailed out over enemy territory. Every paratrooper who jumped into occupied France. Every pilot who survived a damaged aircraft. Their lives hung on threads spun in Seaford, Delaware by women whose names never made it into history books. The work was not safe. Molten nylon reached temperatures exceeding 280 C. A splash could cause third-degree burns. The polymer vapors, if inhaled in concentration, caused respiratory damage. Equipment failures were common. Spinets clogged. Kettles overheated. Cooling systems failed. The women learned to recognize the warning signs. The smell of burning polymer, the slight vibration that preceded a pressure rupture, the color shift in molten nylon that indicated contamination. They worked without fanfare, without recognition, and often without proper protective equipment. Seaford's production records from the war years show only one significant work stoppage, a 3-day shutdown in August 1944 when a steam line ruptured, flooding the spinning floor and forcing evacuation. The women were back within 72 hours, working double shifts to compensate for lost production. DuPont rewarded long service with company-made products and service emblems. A factory newsletter called The Threadline documented their lives, company picnics, bowling leagues, occasional poems written by workers during breaks. The tone was relentlessly cheerful as wartime morale demanded. But beneath the optimism, there was exhaustion. By 1945, some women had been working 12-hour shifts for 3 years straight. In Europe, the war ended on May 8, 1945. In the Pacific, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. 8 days later, on August 23, DuPont made an announcement: nylon production would shift back to civilian use. Stockings would return to store shelves. Women across America who had spent 4 years painting their legs with makeup and drawing seam lines with eyebrow pencil prepared to celebrate. But DuPont had made a miscalculation. The war had consumed their entire nylon output for 3.5 years. The machinery at Seaford had been running at maximum capacity just to meet military demand. There was no reserve. There was no stockpile, and ramping down military orders while ramping up civilian production took time. Time to retool machines. Time to secure different chemical feedstocks. Time to hire and train workers for a different product line. In September 1945, the first post-war shipment of nylon stockings arrived in American cities, 13,000 pairs distributed across the entire country. The announcement triggered something DuPont hadn't anticipated. On September 15, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, women began lining up outside department stores before dawn. By mid-morning, the line stretched 16 city blocks. By noon, 40,000 women had converged on a single store in the East Liberty neighborhood, all competing for approximately 10,000 pairs of stockings designated for working girls only. The restriction was meant to help factory workers and secretaries, women who had taken jobs during the war and needed professional attire. It backfired spectacularly. Women who didn't qualify as working girls felt excluded. Women who did qualify felt patronized, and everyone, regardless of employment status, felt desperate. Stockings had become more than fashion. They had become a symbol of femininity restored of the peacetime life that had been promised. The crowd turned chaotic. Women shoved. They pulled hair. They screamed profanities at men who stood on the sidewalks mocking them. When police arrived to control the crowd, the women turned on the officers. The Pittsburgh Press reported the scene with barely concealed shock. Nylon madness swept through East Liberty yesterday when 40,000 screaming, milling women tried to buy 10,000 pairs for sale to working girls only. Sales girls, overwhelmed and exhausted, worked until midnight trying to process transactions while maintaining some semblance of order. Fights broke out over sizes, over colors, over who had been in line first. Women who secured their purchases clutched the packages like war rations, knowing that stockings might not be available again for months. Pittsburgh was only the beginning. In November 1945, 30,000 women lined up in New York City. In San Francisco, a planned sale was canceled after approximately 10,000 shoppers waiting outside broke the store's front window under the pressure of the crowd. Several women fainted. In Augusta, Georgia, crowds stamped through a retailer, knocking over displays and shelves in a frenzied search for hosiery. A local newspaper headline read, "Women risk life and limb in bitter battle for nylons." In Detroit, The situation appeared more orderly, but only because of heavy police presence captured in photographs. Rows of women standing patiently, officers stationed every few yards to prevent the kind of violence that had erupted elsewhere. The riots continued through the winter of 1945 and into early 1946. January brought fresh shipments and fresh chaos. Macy's in New York sold 50,000 pairs in 6 hours. Women camped overnight in sub-freezing temperatures to secure a place in line. Some hired others to stand in line for them, creating a black market in queue positions. Rumors spread that DuPont was deliberately limiting supply to drive up prices and demand. A conspiracy theory with no evidence, but one that reflected the desperation and mistrust of the moment. In truth, DuPont was struggling to meet demand that had been suppressed for nearly 4 years. The Seaford plant was running at full capacity, but it took time to transition from military specifications to civilian products. The parachute fiber was thicker and coarser than hosiery fiber. The dyes were different. The finishing processes were different. What had been a seamless wartime conversion in 1942 became a logistical nightmare in 1945. The company ramped up production as fast as physically possible. By March 1946, DuPont was producing 30 million pairs of nylon stockings per month, a rate that finally began to satisfy demand. The riots subsided not because women stopped wanting stockings, but because supply had caught up enough that waiting in line became less desperate. By spring 1946, most stores had stockings in stock most of the time. The Nylon Riots, as they became known, faded into history, but they left a mark. They revealed the economic and psychological strain that wartime rationing had placed on American women. They exposed the class tensions that had simmered beneath wartime unity. Working-class women resenting restrictions, middle-class women resenting exclusions. They demonstrated the power of consumer desire. The way a simple product could become a flashpoint for frustration and identity. And they revealed something else. The women who had kept the Seaford plant running during the war were being erased from the narrative. The news coverage of the riots focused on the chaos, the desperation, the spectacle of women fighting over stockings. Almost no coverage mentions the women who had produced those stockings. Almost no one acknowledged that female workers at Seaford had operated dangerous machinery for years, maintaining production that saved lives in combat, only to be dismissed or forgotten once the war ended. The factory newsletter, the Threadline, continued to document life at Seaford, but circulation was internal. The women who had made wartime nylon were invisible to the public that rioted for peacetime nylon. This pattern repeated across American industry. Women who had welded ships, assembled aircraft, operated cranes, and managed production lines were laid off en masse to make room for returning veterans. Some left willingly, eager to rebuild home lives disrupted by war. Others were forced out, given no choice about their employment, and pushed back into lower-paying, less skilled work. The skills they had gained, the competence they had proven, the independence they had tasted, all of it was dismissed as a wartime anomaly. By 1947, the percentage of women in manufacturing had returned to pre-war levels. At Seaford, some women remained. The plant still needed operators, and DuPont, having invested in training, retained a portion of the wartime workforce, but the majority were let go. Their names do not appear in the histories of DuPont. Their contributions are footnotes, if mentioned at all. The Seaford plant, however, thrived. Nylon became DuPont's most profitable product, far exceeding even the company's own optimistic projections. By the late 1940s, demand had stabilized into a massive, steady market. Nylon wasn't just stockings anymore. It was carpets, fabrics, luggage, toothbrush bristles, fishing line, surgical thread, and industrial components. In 1948, one of Seaford's production units was converted into a pilot plant for a new fiber called Fiber X, later introduced as Dacron. The facility became a proving ground for synthetic textiles that would define the second half of the 20th century. Employment at Seaford peaked in the 1970s at approximately 4,700 workers. The plant had become the economic center of the town, the largest employer in Sussex County, a symbol of American industrial might. But global competition was already shifting. By the 1970s, other countries were producing nylon at a fraction of the cost. Consumer tastes were changing. Synthetic fabrics, once revolutionary, were losing popularity to natural fibers and new blends. In the mid-1980s, DuPont began downsizing. Layoffs came in waves. Buildings were closed, then demolished. By 2003, DuPont sold its synthetic fiber division in Vista to Koch Industries. The sale included the Seaford plant. By 2004, employment had dropped to 650 workers. The six-story modern building, once a marvel of industrial architecture, stood partially empty. In 1995, the American Chemical Society designated the DuPont nylon plant in Seaford as a National Historic Chemical Landmark. A plaque was installed commemorating the site where the world's first synthetic fiber was produced on an industrial scale. The ceremony was dignified, respectful, and attended by company executives and local officials. But the plaque does not mention the women. It does not mention the wartime workforce that kept production running when men were overseas. It does not mention the 12-hour shifts, the dangerous conditions, the burns, and respiratory damage. It does not mention that the Nylon Riots of 1946 were fueled by stockings made by women who would never be publicly honored for their work. Today, the Seaford site still manufactures nylon fiber primarily for military uniforms. The operations are smaller, more automated, less visible. The town of Seaford has diversified its economy, no longer dependent on a single factory. But the legacy remains. Every parachute that saved a life in World War II, every stocking that sparked a riot in 1946. Every thread that came from Seaford was touched by hands that history chose to forget. The Nylon Riots were not about stockings. They were about the cost of transformation, the cost of wartime sacrifice, the cost of industrial labor that society demanded but refused to honor. The women who rioted in Pittsburgh and New York were in a strange way connected to the women who worked at Seaford. Both groups were made invisible by the same forces. Consumer culture that valued the product over the producer, a society that celebrated innovation while erasing the human effort behind it. Wallace Carothers never saw any of this. He never knew that his polymer would become a cultural phenomenon.